There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the simple weight of a blanket. They do not announce themselves with thunder or fanfare. They slip into the architecture of your days like a secret key sliding into a lock you never knew was there. And when they turn, they change the shape of every room you will ever live in again. For me, that moment smelled of lavender dryer sheets and the faint, clean scent of rain on pavement, and it was embodied by the man sleeping on my couch. His name was Liam, and this was not the first time he had ended up here. It had become a kind of unspoken ritual over the past few months, a soft landing at the end of his turbulent days. But tonight felt different. The air in my small apartment was thick with a new kind of silence, a silence that wasn't empty, but was instead filled to the brim with unspoken questions. I sat in the worn armchair across from him, a book open but unread in my lap, my focus entirely consumed by the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. The only light came from the dim, amber glow of the street lamp outside my window, which filtered through the blinds and laid thin stripes of gold across the floor, across the edge of the coffee table, across the hand he had dangling over the side of the cushion. I was a photographer. My life was a study in observation, in waiting for the precise instant when light and shadow and emotion converged into a single, honest frame. I had spent years training my eye to see the subtle narrative in a stranger's posture, the history in the lines around their eyes, the ghost of a feeling in a fleeting expression. And for all those years, Liam had been my most compelling, most confounding subject. I had hundreds of photos of him, stored on hard drives and tucked away in archival boxes. Most were candid. Liam laughing with his head thrown back at a crowded party, the light catching in his eyes. Liam focused, brow furrowed, as he rewired a circuit board for some arcane engineering project. Liam staring out at the ocean, his shoulders set against a vast, gray sky, looking smaller than he ever allowed himself to appear in person. I saw things in him through my lens that I was certain no one else did. A flicker of loneliness in his most boisterous moments, a deep well of weariness behind his easy smile. Tonight, watching him sleep, I felt like I was looking through that lens again, but the distance was gone. He was right here, a tangible presence in my quiet space, and the vulnerability I usually only captured from afar was now breathing the same air I was. He had kicked off the heavy wool blanket in his sleep, and it lay pooled around his waist. One of his socked feet was pressed against the arm of the couch, the other rested on the floor. He made a small sound, a soft murmur that was swallowed by the quiet of the room, and shifted, turning his face more towards the light. The stripes from the blinds fell across his cheekbones, highlighting the strong line of his jaw, the slight stubble that was already beginning to shadow his skin. My fingers twitched with the phantom impulse to pick up my camera, to document this fragile truce with gravity, this unguarded moment. But I didn't. This felt too sacred for documentation. It was a secret meant to be held, not captured. The secret, of course, was mine. It was a quiet, persistent ache in my chest that had taken root years ago and had only grown deeper, more complex with time. It was the simple, terrifying truth that my friendship with Liam was the most stable architecture in my life, and that I was in love with him. It was a love that lived in the silences, in the shared glances, in the easy way we could exist in the same room for hours without needing to speak. It was patient and observant, much like me, and it was utterly, hopelessly hidden, because Liam was my best friend. And Liam, as far as I and everyone else knew, was straight. He was the sun around which so many other people orbited, and I was just one of his many satellites, content to exist in his steady, predictable light. He shivered, a slight tremor that ran through his shoulders, and without thinking, I stood up. My movements were slow, deliberate, as if I were navigating a room filled with sleeping birds. I picked up the blanket from where it had fallen, the wool soft and heavy in my hands. It still held a faint warmth from his body. I leaned over him, my own breath catching in my throat. He smelled of the soap from my shower and something uniquely his own, a scent like cedar and clean linen that I knew as well as my own. I gently draped the blanket over him, tucking it around his shoulders. My fingers brushed against the collar of his t-shirt, the skin of his neck warm and alive beneath the soft cotton. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through me, a sharp, resonant hum that vibrated all the way to my core. I pulled my hand back as if burned. I stood there for a long moment, my heart hammering against my ribs, just watching him breathe, watching the blanket rise and fall. This was the boundary. This was the line I walked every single day. The line between friend and something else, between caring for him and caring for him too much. And tonight, in the quiet solitude of my apartment, that line felt thinner, more fragile than ever before. It felt like a single thread, and I was terrified that with one wrong move, one exhale too loud, it would snap. We had met in a way that felt almost like a cliché, a collision of two completely different worlds in the sterile, brightly lit environment of a university classroom. I was a second-year fine arts major, completely immersed in the world of darkrooms, chemical baths, and the infinite grayscale possibilities of black and white film. My life was measured in f-stops and shutter speeds. He was a third-year engineering student, his world one of logic, equations, and the unyielding certainty of physics. He was taking Introduction to Photography to fulfill a humanities credit he'd put off for as long as possible. He told me later he chose it because he thought it would be an easy A, something about just pointing a camera and clicking a button. He learned very quickly how wrong he was. I remember the first day I truly saw him. Not just noticed him as the loud, confident guy who sat in the back of the lecture hall and cracked jokes with his friends, but really saw him. We were in the campus darkroom for our first printing session. The air was thick with the acrid, metallic smell of fixer and stop bath, a scent I had come to find deeply comforting. The only light came from the dim, eerie red of the safe lights, which cast everyone in a strange, demonic glow. I was methodical, patient, moving through the steps with a practiced ease. Develop, stop, fix, wash. A ritual I knew by heart. Liam, on the other hand, was a study in contained chaos. He was fumbling with his tongs, dropping his photographic paper into the wrong chemical trays, and cursing under his breath in a low, frustrated whisper that was still somehow audible over the gurgle of the running water. He was holding a dripping print up to the red light, a look of profound bewilderment on his face. The image was a mess, a streaky, fogged-over landscape that was almost completely black. "I don't get it," he'd said, to no one in particular. I followed the instructions. I counted the seconds. I had been watching him from my own station, a small smile playing on my lips. There was something endearing about seeing this person, who moved through the world with such an effortless confidence, being so thoroughly defeated by a sheet of light-sensitive paper. I walked over, my own tongs dripping into the tray. "You're agitating too much," I said, my voice quiet in the small space. He jumped slightly, startled. He hadn't seen me approach. "You're sloshing it around like you're mixing a drink. You have to be gentle. Just rock the tray, slow and steady." He looked from me to his ruined print and then back again. In the strange red light, I couldn't make out the color of his eyes, but I could see the frustration warring with a reluctant curiosity. "Right?" he said, a little defensively. "Gentle." I took his next sheet of paper, the one he'd just exposed under the enlarger, and guided him through the process. My hand rested lightly on his as I showed him how to use the tongs, how to slip the paper into the developer in one smooth motion. His hands, which I knew could assemble complex machinery and solve dizzying equations, were surprisingly unsteady. I showed him how to rock the tray, the slow, rhythmic motion that coaxed the image out of the paper's emulsion. We stood there side by side in the crimson gloom, watching as the ghost of an image began to appear. A shot of the campus clock tower, its lines slowly sharpening, emerging from the milky white like a memory surfacing. A slow smile spread across his face, one of genuine wonder. "Whoa," he whispered. "It's like magic." That was the beginning. After that, he started seeking me out. First, it was for help with assignments. Then it was to talk about camera settings, and soon, It was about everything else. We discovered a strange, complementary rhythm. He was the force of nature, all bright energy and forward momentum, and I was the quiet harbor where he could anchor. He would talk for hours about his classes, his frustrations with thermodynamics, the drama with his on-again, off-again girlfriend, the pressure from his family to succeed. I would listen, offering a quiet comment here and there, but mostly just providing a space for him to exist without the need for performance. I became his confidant, the keeper of the thoughts he didn't share with his louder, more boisterous circle of friends. They saw Liam the star athlete, the engineering prodigy, the life of the party. I saw Liam who was terrified of failing, who felt a profound loneliness even when surrounded by people, who just wanted someone to be quiet with. My feelings for him didn't arrive in a single, lightning strike moment. They developed slowly, like one of my photographs in the chemical bath. It was a gradual process of emergence, of details coming into focus that had been there all along. It was in the way my stomach would flip when he'd greet me from across the quad with a wave and that ridiculously bright smile. It was in the way I started cataloging the small things, the way he ran a hand through his hair when he was stressed, the specific cadence of his laugh, the fact that he always stole the blue M&Ms out of the bag first. The moment of clarity, the instant the image became undeniably fixed, came during our final year. We were at a mutual friend's birthday party, a loud, crowded affair in a cramped off-campus house. The music was thumping, people were shouting over each other, and the air was hot and sticky. I was never comfortable in those settings, usually finding a quiet corner to observe from until I could make a polite exit. I was leaning against a wall, nursing a warm beer, when I saw him across the room. He was in the center of a circle, telling some animated story, and everyone was captivated. He was incandescent. And then, in the middle of his own punchline, his eyes found mine across the room. He didn't stop his story, but his smile changed. It softened, just for a second, into something quieter, something just for me. A silent acknowledgement. I see you there. I'm glad you're here. In that fraction of a second, the entire chaotic room fell away, and it was just the two of us. The vague warmth I'd always felt for him crystallized into something sharp, painful, and breathtakingly clear. Oh, I was in love with him. The realization didn't feel like a discovery, but a confirmation of a truth my body had known long before my brain was willing to admit it. And with that clarity came a deep, chilling fear. Because I knew, with absolute certainty, that it was a love I could never, ever speak aloud. To do so would be to risk the entire foundation of the most important friendship I had ever known. So I packed it away, that truth, tucking it into a quiet, protected room inside myself, a room I never let anyone, especially him, enter. For years after we graduated, our friendship remained the one constant in the shifting landscape of our early 20s. We ended up in the same city, living in the same apartment complex, by a stroke of what Liam called cosmic broincidence, and what I privately considered a kindness from a universe that rarely felt kind. He got a demanding job as a software consultant that had him traveling frequently, and I pieced together a living as a freelance photographer, shooting weddings, portraits, and whatever else paid the bills while I worked on my personal art projects. Our lives were different, but our bond was the same. He was still the sun, and I was still the satellite. He dated a series of women, bright, ambitious, beautiful women who, for one reason or another, never seemed to last. I watched from the sidelines, a supportive friend, my own love life a barren, untilled field. I went on a few dates, tried to find a spark, but it always felt like I was performing a role, my heart stubbornly tethered to a possibility that wasn't possible. My apartment became his unofficial second home, the place he came to decompress after a long trip, to complain about his boss, to celebrate a success, or, more often than not, to nurse a broken heart. I was the safe harbor, the constant. I was the one person he didn't have to pretend for. I was his best friend. And it was a role I played with painstaking care, because I knew that if I let the truth slip, if he ever saw the depth of my feelings, I would lose him entirely. It was a slow, quiet form of self-immolation, but the warmth of his friendship was worth the burn. The shift began, as so many seismic changes do, not with a bang, but with a slow, grinding dissolution. Her name was Sarah, and she was the most serious of all his girlfriends. They had been together for nearly 2 years, a lifetime in Liam's romantic history. She was a lawyer, sharp and witty and ambitious, and for a while, I genuinely thought she was the one for him. They moved in together, they talked about the future, they adopted a ridiculously neurotic beagle named Winston. From my vantage point across the hall, their life looked like a finished picture, perfectly composed. I was happy for him. In that painful, hollow way you can be happy for someone whose happiness underscores your own private loneliness. I saw less of him during that time, our late-night talks replaced by his new domesticity, and I told myself it was for the best. It was easier to keep my feelings locked away when the door was so seldom tested. But then, cracks began to appear in the perfect composition. The breakup wasn't a single, dramatic event. It was a death by 1,000 paper cuts, a slow erosion of connection that I observed in fragments. I'd hear their raised voices through the thin apartment walls, a rarity that became more frequent. I'd see Liam on his own, walking Winston in the park, his shoulders slumped, a deep, weary tension in his jaw that I recognized from his most stressful university days. He started showing up at my door again, initially under thin pretexts, to borrow a book, to ask about a piece of mail, to bring me a slice of a pizza he'd ordered for himself. He rarely mentioned Sarah directly, but he didn't have to. The unhappiness radiated from him like a low-grade fever. He was a planet slowly being pulled out of orbit, his gravitational center failing. The end, when it came, was quiet. One Saturday afternoon, I saw Sarah loading boxes into her car. There was no shouting, no tears, just a grim, methodical silence. Later that evening, Liam knocked on my door. He was holding Winston's leash in one hand and a six-pack of beer in the other. He looked utterly wrecked. His eyes were red-rimmed, and the easy smile he usually wore was gone, replaced by a tight, strained line. "She's gone," he said, his voice rough. He didn't need to say anything more. I just stepped aside and let him in. He sank onto my couch, and Winston immediately curled up at his feet, letting out a mournful sigh as if on cue. That was the night the old patterns reemerged, but with a new, desperate weight. He talked for hours, circling the drain of the relationship, trying to pinpoint the exact moment it had all gone wrong. It wasn't about blame, not really. It was about a profound sense of failure and a deep, gnawing loneliness that he was finally allowing himself to voice. "It's the quiet," he said, staring at the bottle in his hands. I forgot how loud the quiet is when you're alone." I listened, as I always had, letting the words wash over me, offering what little comfort I could. I was his friend. That was my job. But something inside me, a selfish and hopeful and terrible little thing, stirred. The room that had been built for him inside me, the one I kept locked, felt its door tremble on its hinges. He fell asleep on the couch around 3 in the morning, mid-sentence. I took the beer bottle from his slackened grip, turned off the lights, and covered him with the old wool blanket I kept on the back of my armchair. I stood there for a long time, watching him in the dark, the same way I would months later. He looked so much younger in sleep, the lines of stress and worry smoothed from his face. This was the catalyst. This was the moment the ground shifted beneath our feet. He had lost his anchor, and in his adrift state, he was turning to me, his safe harbor. But I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that what he was seeking was more than just friendship. He was seeking a kind of intimacy, a closeness to fill the void Sarah had left behind. And I was in the perilous position of being the only one willing and able to provide it, all while pretending it meant nothing more to me than it did to him. The long, slow ritual was about to begin. It started, as it had that first night, with him on the couch. After the breakup, my apartment became his default location. He'd come over after work, exhausted from the forced cheerfulness of his corporate life, and just collapse into the worn cushions. We'd order food, put on a movie we'd both seen a dozen times, and the comfortable silence would settle around us. More often than not, he would drift off to sleep before the credits rolled. In those early weeks, I would let him be. I'd finish my own work, tidy up the kitchen, and then retreat to my bedroom, leaving him to the living room. I'd lie awake for hours, acutely aware of his presence just one room away. The knowledge that he was there, breathing in the dark, turned my small apartment into a charged space. Every floorboard creak, every sigh from the other room, a momentous event. It was a sweet kind of torture, having him so close, yet so completely out of reach. The first escalation was subtle, almost accidental. It was a cold night in late autumn, the kind of damp, bone-chilling cold that seeps through window frames and makes you feel it in your joints. We had been talking late, and he was stretched out on the couch, the wool blanket pulled up to his chin. I was about to head to bed when he spoke, his voice thick with impending sleep. "Hey," he mumbled, his eyes already closed. "It's freezing out here. The draft from that window is brutal." I paused, my hand on the doorframe of my bedroom. My heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat. I knew what was coming next, or at least, I hoped I did. And the hope was so terrifying I almost couldn't breathe. "My room's warmer," I said, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. It wasn't a direct invitation, but it was a door left ajar. A long silence stretched between us, filled only by the sound of the wind rattling the glass. Then he said, so quietly I almost missed it, "Yeah?" Another beat of silence. I could have closed the door. I could have said good night and walked away, preserving the safe, established boundary between us. But I didn't. "Yeah," I replied, my voice just as soft. "You can. If you want." He didn't answer right away. He just sighed, a long, weary sound, and then I heard the rustle of the blanket as he sat up. He shuffled into my room, a ghost in the darkness, and without another word, he climbed into the empty side of my queen-sized bed. He pulled the covers up, turned his back to me, and within minutes, the sound of his deep, even breathing filled the room. I stood by the door for what felt like an eternity, my entire nervous system alight. Then, moving with excruciating slowness, I got into my own bed. I lay on my back, ramrod straight, staring up at the ceiling, every muscle in my body tensed. He was there. He was in my bed. The sheer, overwhelming reality of it was dizzying. I was acutely aware of the space between us, a scant foot of mattress that felt both like an impassable chasm and a dangerously narrow ledge. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just listened to him breathe. That night cracked something open. It created a new possibility, a new shape our friendship could take. The pretext of the cold room was the key that unlocked the door, and once it was open, it was never fully closed again. It didn't happen every night, but it began to happen with increasing frequency. Sometimes there was a reason. "I have an early flight, don't want to wake you when I leave," or "my radiator is making a weird noise." But soon, the reasons fell away, replaced by an unspoken understanding. If it was late, if he was tired, if the world felt too heavy, he would just end up in my bed. The ritual became ingrained. He would take the side by the wall. I would take the side by the door. We would lie on our respective edges of the mattress, our backs to each other, two separate islands in a sea of white sheets. My nights became a masterclass in hyper-awareness. I learned the cartography of his sleep. I knew the subtle shift in his breathing that signaled his descent from light slumber into a deeper dream state. I knew how he would twitch just before falling asleep, a last shudder of the day's tension leaving his body. I could feel the heat radiating from him across the small distance, a warmth that my own body yearned to move towards. It was an exercise in agonizing self-control. Every instinct screamed at me to close the distance, to roll over, to press my back against his, to feel the solid, comforting weight of him. But I never did. I was the quiet observer, the guardian of this fragile, unspoken arrangement. I feared that any move on my part, any acknowledgement of the electric current that hummed in the space between us, would shatter the plausible deniability we were both clinging to. This was just two friends sharing a bed. It was practical. It meant nothing. I had to believe that, because the alternative was too much to bear. The first time he touched me, it was so slight I thought I had imagined it. We were both asleep, or I was pretending to be. In the deep quiet of the night, I felt a subtle pressure against my calf. His foot had drifted over in his sleep and was now resting against mine. The point of contact was no bigger than a silver dollar, just the edge of his ankle against mine, but it sent a shockwave through my entire body. I froze, my breath trapped in my lungs. My mind raced, cataloging the sensation, the rough texture of his sock against my bare skin, the weight of it, the warmth. It was an anchor, a small point of connection in the vast emptiness of the bed. I lay perfectly still, terrified that if I moved, he would pull away. I willed him to stay, pouring all my silent, desperate energy into that one small point of contact. He didn't move. And after a while, my frantic heartbeat slowed, and a profound, bone-deep sense of peace settled over me. It was the first time in months I felt like I could truly rest. The touches grew from there, always under the cloak of sleep, always deniable. A hand that would migrate from his pillow to the space between us, his fingertips brushing my back, his knee bumping against mine. Each instance was a secret I collected, a precious, terrifying piece of evidence in a case I was building inside my own head. The prosecution argued that it was all meaningless, the random movements of a sleeping body. The defense, a small, hopeful voice, argued that it was his subconscious reaching for me, seeking a comfort he couldn't ask for when he was awake. I was the judge and jury, and I could never reach a verdict. The turning point in the ritual, the moment it escalated from passive to active, came on a particularly bad night. He had received some crushing news from work. A project he had poured his soul into for months had been unceremoniously canceled. He came to my apartment looking hollowed out, the vibrant energy that always surrounded him completely extinguished. He didn't want to talk. He just sat on the couch, staring at the blank television screen, while I made us tea. When it was time for bed, he followed me into the bedroom like a sleepwalker. He got into his usual side, but instead of turning his back to me immediately, he lay facing my side of the bed, his eyes open and staring at nothing. I got in and settled into my own spot, the tension in the room a palpable thing. We lay like that for a long time, in the dark, facing the same direction but not looking at each other. The silence was heavier than usual, weighted with his despair. I wanted so badly to say something, to offer some inadequate comfort, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, I heard him take a shaky breath. And then he moved. He rolled onto his side, facing me. In the dim light filtering in from the window, I could just make out the shape of him, the dark silhouette of his head on the pillow. My heart stopped. This was new territory. We had never faced each other. And then he moved again, closing the remaining distance between us. He pressed his forehead against my shoulder, his breath warm against my neck. He curled his body into mine, one arm coming to rest across my waist, his hand splayed against my stomach. His legs tangled with mine. He was holding on to me, not like a lover, but like a drowning man holding onto a piece of driftwood. He was clinging to me for warmth, for stability, for something solid in his spinning world. I lay there, rigid with shock, with a terrifying, overwhelming joy. My entire body was a live wire. I could feel the frantic beat of his heart against my back. I could feel the slight tremor in his hand. He was seeking refuge in me, and my body was his shelter. Slowly, cautiously, I let myself relax into his hold. I let my own tense muscles soften. I took a deep, steadying breath, and then another. And then, I did something I had never dared to do before. I lifted my own hand and placed it over his, my fingers lacing through his. His hand was warm and strong in mine. He responded instantly, his grip tightening around my hand, a silent, desperate message of gratitude. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief, and buried his face deeper into my shoulder. In that moment, the line between us, the one I had guarded so fiercely for so many years, dissolved into nothing. He needed me, and for the first time, he was letting me hold him back. We fell asleep like that, tangled together in the dark, and for the first time, it didn't feel like an accident. It felt like a homecoming. The ritual had found its final form. After that night, the pretense of distance was abandoned. We still slept on our own sides of the bed, but sometime in the night, we would always find our way back to each other. It became our unspoken language. It was a language of touch, of proximity, of shared warmth in the dark. It was a conversation held in the space between waking and sleeping, where the rules of the day didn't apply. I learned that the architecture of comfort wasn't built from words, but from the simple, solid presence of another person. Yet, for all this profound physical intimacy, we never spoke of it. In the morning, we would wake up, untangle ourselves with a careful, almost shy choreography, and pretend that we had slept soundly on our own sides of the bed. We would make coffee, talk about the day ahead, and fall back into our roles as best friends. The night was a separate country, with its own rules and its own truths, and we never brought our passports with us into the daylight. The tension was exquisite, a high-wire act performed every single night. I existed in a state of perpetual yearning, of being given everything and nothing all at once. I had his body, his trust, his vulnerability, but I didn't have his heart, not in the way I wanted. I didn't know what he felt, what he thought, what this meant to him. And I was too afraid to ask, too terrified that giving voice to the question would break the spell and send him retreating back to his own side of the bed, this time for good. The night it all broke was unremarkable. There was no catalyst, no external drama. There was only the accumulated weight of all the things we had left unsaid. It had been a long week for both of us. My deadline on a big project had me chained to my computer, and Liam was preparing for a major presentation at work. We were both frayed at the edges, worn thin by our respective pressures. We fell into bed that night with a shared, bone-deep exhaustion. For the first time in weeks, we lay on our separate sides, back to back, the space between us feeling cold and vast again. The silence wasn't comfortable. It was taut, stretched thin like a wire about to snap. I lay there, listening to the quiet sounds of the apartment, my mind racing. I couldn't do this anymore. The ambiguity was hollowing me out, leaving me feeling more alone when he was next to me than when I was actually by myself. The nightly comfort had become a source of profound pain, a reminder of everything I couldn't have. I was on the verge of sleep when his voice cut through the darkness, quiet and hesitant. Leo, my real name. He almost never used it. I was Lee to him, a nickname from college that had stuck. Hearing my full name from him now felt strangely formal, significant. I felt my entire body tense. Yeah, I managed to reply, my own voice raspy with sleep and apprehension. He was silent for a long moment, and I thought maybe I had imagined it. But then he shifted, the mattress dipping with his weight as he rolled over to face my back. I could feel his presence behind me, a warmth that didn't touch, but was felt nonetheless. I stayed perfectly still, my back to him, my heart hammering against my ribs. Can you turn over? He asked. His voice was barely a whisper, freighted with a vulnerability I had never heard from him before, not even on his worst nights. This was it. This was the moment the earth stopped spinning on its axis. Every instinct I had honed over years of self-protection screamed at me to pretend I was asleep, to ignore the request, to keep the fragile peace. But the part of me that was so tired of pretending, so weary of living in the half-light of what-ifs, won out. Slowly, with a sense of both dread and inevitability, I rolled over to face him. In the slivers of moonlight cutting through the blinds, I could see his face. His expression was open, unguarded, his eyes searching mine in the gloom. He looked terrified. He looked hopeful. He looked like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, and he was asking me to jump with him. We lay there for an eternity, just looking at each other. The air was thick, electric. I could feel the frantic pulse in my own throat. He lifted a hand, his movements slow, tentative, as if he were afraid I would bolt. He gently brushed a strand of hair off my forehead. His fingers were warm, and they trembled slightly against my skin. The simple, deliberate touch, performed in the full, silent awareness of the waking world, was more intimate than all the nights we had spent wrapped around each other in sleep. It was an acknowledgement. It was a confession. Would it be okay? He whispered, his voice cracking on the last word. He didn't have to finish the sentence. I knew what he was asking. The question hung in the air between us, a fragile, beautiful thing. And in that moment, all my fear, all my carefully constructed walls, all the years of hiding, they just fell away. All that was left was the simple, undeniable truth that was reflected in his eyes. I didn't answer with words. I just nodded, a small, jerky movement. A wave of relief washed over his face, so profound it was almost painful to witness. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away, to change my mind. I didn't. I met him halfway. The first touch of his lips to mine was impossibly soft. It wasn't a kiss of passion or demand. It was a question. It was a hesitant exploration, a discovery. It was tender and careful and unbelievably gentle. It tasted of salt and relief and the end of a long, lonely wait. It felt like coming home to a place I hadn't known I was searching for. In that quiet, moonlit room, the unspoken thing that had lived between us for years finally found its voice. And it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The morning after was a landscape of blinding, terrifying silence. I woke up first, to the pale gray light of dawn filtering into the room. For a blissful, disoriented moment, I felt only a deep, humming warmth. Liam was still asleep, his arm thrown possessively over my waist, his face peaceful, tucked into the curve of my neck. The memory of the kiss, of the soft, whispered words that followed, of finally falling asleep facing each other, was a warm, liquid gold in my veins. But as the room brightened, so did my anxiety. The night had been a dream, a pocket universe outside of time. The day was reality, and reality had consequences. He stirred beside me, his breathing changing. I felt him become aware of our position, of his arm around me, of my leg tangled with his. He went completely still. It was a tense, sudden rigidity, the stillness of a startled animal. Then, slowly, carefully, he extracted himself. He slid his arm from my waist and rolled away from me, creating a gulf of cold air between us. He sat up on the edge of the bed, his back to me, and for a long moment, he just sat there, running a hand through his already messy hair. The silence was no longer intimate. It was brittle, fragile, a sheet of thin ice I was afraid to step on. I should go, he said, his voice low and gravelly, directed at the floor. He didn't look at me. He stood up, pulled on the jeans he'd left crumpled on the floor, and grabbed his t-shirt. He moved with a jerky, unnatural haste, a man desperate to flee the scene of a crime. I have that thing. The presentation, Liam, I said, my voice small. He froze, his hand on the doorknob, but he still wouldn't turn around. I'll text you later, he said, and then he was gone. The bedroom door clicked shut behind him, and a few seconds later, I heard the front door of my apartment close with a soft, final thud. I lay there, staring at the empty space where he had been, the warmth of his body already fading from the sheets. The beautiful, golden feeling in my chest had curdled into a cold, heavy dread. I had been a fool. I had misinterpreted everything. The kiss hadn't been a beginning. It had been a moment of confusion, of grief-fueled desperation on his part. A mistake. And now he was gone, and he had taken our friendship with him. The silence he left behind was the loudest, most painful sound I had ever heard. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. My phone remained silent. My texts to him, casual, carefully worded inquiries about his presentation, about his week, went unanswered, sitting in my outbox with the cold, damning blue checkmark of read. I saw him once, getting his mail in the lobby of our building. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. I saw a flash of panic in his before he looked away, gave me a tight, barely perceptible nod, and practically ran for the elevator. The rejection was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. The safe harbor had become a shipwreck. The quiet room inside me, where I had kept my love for him locked away, now felt like a tomb. I cycled through a brutal rotation of emotions. First came the hurt, a raw, gaping wound. Then came the anger, at him for his cowardice, for being so willing to throw away years of friendship because he was scared. But mostly, I was angry at myself. I had been so stupid, so blinded by my own hope that I had failed to see the truth. I was his comfort object, his human heating pad. I was a temporary fix for his loneliness, a convenient port in a storm. I had mistaken a desperate need for affection as genuine, specific desire for me. The thought was humiliating, a shame so hot it made my skin crawl. I tried to work, to lose myself in the familiar process of my darkroom, but even there, his ghost followed me. Every photo I developed seemed to be a reflection of my own folly, every shadow a symbol of what I had lost. After a week of this agonizing silence, something inside me shifted. The pain was still there, but it was joined by a hard, cold resolve. I couldn't live like this. I couldn't live in the apartment across the hall from a ghost, flinching every time I heard footsteps in the hallway. I couldn't let our story end with a closed door and an unread text message. Our friendship, even if it was all that was left, deserved more than that. It deserved an honest ending, not a slow, cowardly fade to black. If he was going to break my heart, he was going to have to do it to my face. I found him at the small park a few blocks from our building, the one where he always took Winston. He was sitting on a bench, staring out at the duck pond, the dog's leash looped around his wrist. He looked tired, shoulders slumped, the same way he had the night of his breakup with Sarah. My anger faltered, replaced by the familiar, aching pull of compassion. But I pushed it down. I needed clarity more than I needed to comfort him. I walked up and stood in front of him, blocking his view. He looked up, and when he saw me, his face crumpled. He looked like a man who had finally been caught after a long, exhausting chase. "We need to talk," I said. My voice was quiet but firm, leaving no room for argument. He just nodded, patting the empty space on the bench beside him. I sat down, leaving a careful foot of distance between us. For a long time, we just sat in silence, listening to the distant sounds of traffic and the quacking of the ducks. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. "Just tell me the truth, Liam," I said, my voice raw. "Was it a mistake? Was it just a moment of weakness? Because if it was, I can handle that. I can. But what I can't handle is this. This silence. This pretending I don't exist. You are erasing years of friendship because you're too scared to have one honest conversation. I deserve better than that. We deserved better than that." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were swimming with a miserable cocktail of fear and guilt and profound sadness. "It wasn't a mistake," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "That's what's so terrifying. It wasn't a mistake." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "Leo, I don't know who I am anymore. All my life, I've had this map, this plan. You go to school, you get the good job, you meet the nice girl, you get married. It's the story everyone tells you. It's the story I told myself." He gestured vaguely with one hand. "And it all fell apart. When Sarah left, it wasn't just losing her. It was losing the map. I was completely lost." He looked down at his hands, turning them over and over. "And then there was you. You were the only thing that felt solid. Being with you, in your apartment. It was the only time I felt safe. The only time the quiet wasn't loud. And those nights, lying next to you, it was more than just comfort. I felt." He trailed off, struggling for the words. "I felt seen, in a way I don't think I ever have before. Not even with her." He finally met my eyes again, his own filled with a desperate plea for understanding. "That night, when I kissed you, it was the most honest thing I've done in my entire life. It felt right. It felt like I was finally pointing in the right direction. And it scared the hell out of me. Because that direction isn't on any of my maps. It changes everything. It changes who I thought I was. And I panicked. I ran. And I've been running all week. And I am so sorry, Leo. I'm so sorry I hurt you." He had started to cry, silent tears tracking down his face. And in that moment, all my anger, all my hurt, just evaporated. It was replaced by a wave of overwhelming empathy. He wasn't a coward. He was just a man who had been given a compass that pointed to a world he had never known existed, and he was terrified to take the first step. I closed the distance between us on the bench, and I took his hand. It was cold and trembling. I held it tightly in both of mine. "You don't need a map, Liam," I said softly. "You just need to be honest. With yourself. And with me. We can figure out the rest together. Or we can figure it out apart. But we have to start with the truth." He looked at our joined hands, and then back up at my face. A small, watery smile touched his lips. Okay, he whispered. Okay. The truth, he took another deep breath, a little steadier this time. The truth is, I think I'm falling in love with you. It was not a magic wand. His confession in the park didn't instantly erase the years of his ingrained self-perception or the raw hurt of his week-long disappearing act. It was, instead, a foundation. A small, solid patch of ground in the middle of a vast, confusing wilderness, a place where we could finally begin to build something new, something honest. We walked back to our apartment building that day in a quiet that was entirely different from the ones that had come before. It wasn't the comfortable silence of old friendship, nor the charged silence of unspoken desire, nor the agonizing silence of his withdrawal. This was a fragile, tentative silence, the kind you find in the early morning after a storm has passed, when the world feels both washed clean and uncertain of what comes next. We started over. Not from the beginning, because our shared history was the bedrock of whatever this was, but from that moment of truth on the park bench. We began to talk. Really talk. We spent hours on my couch, not with the distraction of a movie, but facing each other, unraveling the tangled threads of his confusion and my long-held feelings. He told me about the suffocating pressure he'd always felt to be a certain kind of man, the kind his father was, the kind his friends were. He admitted that his relationships with women had always felt like he was playing a part, following a script he'd been handed, and that the moments of true connection had always been fleeting. He confessed that the emotional intimacy he found with me, the easy silences, the unconditional acceptance, was something he had never experienced with anyone else, and that he had simply filed it under the category of best friendship because he had no other framework for it. I, in turn, finally unlocked the door to that quiet room inside myself. I told him everything. I told him about the party in college, the moment I knew I loved him. I told him about the years of carefully guarding my heart, of watching him with other people, of the quiet ache that had become a permanent part of my internal landscape. I told him about the sweet agony of our nightly ritual, of lying next to him and wanting so much more, of being terrified to breathe for fear of breaking the spell. Laying my vulnerability bare like that was one of the most frightening things I had ever done. But as I spoke, I saw not pity or revulsion in his eyes, but a dawning understanding, a profound sense of regret for the pain his own blindness had caused me. He listened to my confession not as an accusation, but as a gift, a map to a part of my world he had never been allowed to see. The physical landscape of our lives began to change, reflecting our new internal reality. His apartment across the hall, which had for so long been a symbol of our separate lives, became little more than a storage unit. He started keeping a toothbrush in my bathroom, a few changes of clothes in my closet. The pretext was gone. He was no longer a guest seeking temporary shelter. He was a resident. He was home. The door to his own apartment, once the symbol of his plausible deniability, was now always closed and locked, because he was always on my side of the hallway. Our nights transformed. The bed was no longer a space of unspoken tension and deniable accidents. It was a place of deliberate, intentional intimacy. We would get into bed and turn to face each other. We would talk, our voices soft in the darkness, about our days, our fears, our small, silly hopes for the future. He would reach for my hand, his fingers lacing through mine, and the simple, conscious act of it felt more significant than all the times our bodies had found each other in sleep. Cuddling was no longer a desperate grasp for comfort, but a mutual, peaceful settling. He would pull me against his chest, and I would rest my head in the hollow of his shoulder, his chin resting on the top of my head, and we would just breathe together, a slow, steady rhythm. The peace that settled over me in those moments was something I had never known was possible. It was the quiet hum of a want finally, truly satisfied. It was the feeling of being completely known and completely safe. One rainy Sunday afternoon, I was sorting through a box of old prints in my studio space, which was really just a converted corner of my living room. Liam was on the couch, Winston asleep at his feet, reading a book. A comfortable, domestic quiet filled the room. I came across a photograph I had taken of him years ago, back in college. It was one of my favorites. He was sitting on the steps of the library, squinting into the sun, a textbook open on his lap. He was looking away from the camera, off into the distance, a thoughtful, almost lonely expression on his face. It was a beautiful photograph, technically perfect, but looking at it now, I saw it for what it was, a portrait of a man I loved from a distance, a man I could only capture when he wasn't looking. I picked up my camera from the desk. It felt heavy and right in my hands. "Hey," I said. He looked up from his book, a questioning smile on his face. The afternoon light from the window was soft, diffuse, and it fell across his face in the most beautiful way. "Don't move," I said, raising the camera to my eye. He laughed, a soft, easy sound. "What, right now?" "I'm a mess. You're perfect," I said, my voice serious. I looked at him through the viewfinder. He was looking directly at me, directly into the lens. His smile was gone, replaced by an expression of open, trusting vulnerability. There was no performance, no guard. It was just him. All the love I felt for him, all the history, all the quiet hope for our future, it was all there in his eyes. I pressed the shutter. The click was a quiet, satisfying sound in the still room. I knew, without even needing to see the image, that it would be the best photograph I had ever taken. It was a portrait of a man who was looking back at me, a man who was finally, truly home. That is how we healed. We didn't heal with grand gestures or dramatic proclamations. We healed in the small moments, in the quiet spaces. We healed in the making of morning coffee, in the sharing of a blanket, in the simple, profound act of holding hands in the dark. We learned that the strongest structures are not built quickly or loudly. They are built slowly, brick by brick, with patience and honesty and a willingness to tear down the old walls to let in a new and better light. The love between us was no longer a secret kept in a locked room inside of me. It was the very air in the apartment, the light in the windows, the foundation on which we were building our new life. There are moments that arrive disguised as something ordinary, and you only understand their true weight in retrospect. But there are other moments, rarer and more precious, that announce themselves with a quiet, breathtaking clarity. They are the moments when you look at the person lying next to you in the soft morning light, their hair a mess, their face peaceful in sleep, and you feel a sense of rightness so profound it stills the entire world. It is the moment you realize that home is not a place on a map, not a set of four walls, but the steady, gentle rhythm of another person's breathing. And in that beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, we had finally found ours.